show our schedule. Go to the website, there's a schedule page. We already did 2 meetings on 2 papers related to online Bayesian inference. And then the first in the RL debates was Eli back in early October. Now today is Fritz. Next week we have Niels from 1,000 Brains project. Then we're gonna have Adam, and who's here with us. And then there's one paper that is not part of the RL debates officially, but it's actually very relevant. So this is a paper from Mitya Szyklowski, where they bring the notion of agency down to the level of neurons. So that's a pretty interesting paper. Then finally, the last contender is Thomas Ringstrom. And after that, January next year, we're going to have final debate and synthesis. Okay, so now let's start with Fritz. It is my great pleasure to introduce Fritz. So people in Berkeley and Redwood, of course we know Fritz, but I'm gonna ask you to maybe introduce yourself for briefly. Tell us about your background and research interests for the people on Zoom, and then we can start.
Okay, Hadi. Can people hear me also on Zoom? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, there's a thumbs up.
Okay, good. Yeah, well, I don't know what to say about myself. I kind of happened to become a neuroscientist by chance, by an error somehow. I started as a physicist and actually worked on solid state physics, in particular storage of hydrogen technology, basically storage of hydrogen molecules in metal lead. And at the time, this was just, when I did this a while ago, as you gather, then this was not really a winning proposal at the time. No one was interested in alternative technologies to actually standard gasoline. I went to a solid state conference, heard about Hopfield networks and that you can analyze them. And of course, I knew some of these spin glass theories and so on. And that got me kind of hooked neural networks. And then I happened to actually know one of the directors of the Max Planck Institute for Biocybernetics in Tübingen. And I asked him for advice, and I ended up advised by a mathematician turned neuroscientist, about who will talk a little bit in following. Yes, so somehow this made, so I made the transition and then became a pure theorist in neuroscience. So I've never done an experiment in my entire life.
Not too late.
Here for me, it is too late. I mean, but I'm married to an experimentalist. And sometimes, if an oscilloscope breaks, or so I actually will go into the lab and the oscilloscope. But usually when the animal is on the table.
Perks of marrying a theorist. But I think you work with real data. This is something I want to mention is that having looked at your work or just talked to you at the Redwood team, I just realized you managed to appreciate both mathematical beauty and the messiness of the real biology. That's something I can learn as a recovering physicist. So that's hard.
Yeah. No, I mean, I made a transition after I made the transition, I ended up in a neuroanatomy lab. And people really, there were these artists who would just prepare, half a brain and slice brains. And I would see the beauty of this neuroanatomy, and it really got me hooked with neuroanatomy data first, but then, of course, also I talked to physiologists and started to work with data. But still, I would say I have a split brain. Some of the stuff is more abstract and some is more.
It's a different type of, it's like an acquired taste, maybe.
Right, yeah. But okay, let's get here. Let's cut to the chase. So Daniel Little, who was a PhD student in my lab, he became very interested. Usually neuroscientists always divide the brain into a sensor part, into a motor part, and some work on the motor part, and some work on the sensor part. And the sensor people, they just consider these neural coding things, and the motor, they think about how to, how to produce these primitives of motor behavior. And we thought there is just something missing. A brain never is just looking at sensory data or producing output. It's always the closed loop. You have to understand learning in the closed loop. It's not good enough just to look at an open information channel and see what goes in and what comes out, because this is just not the situation brains are in. So that was kind of our revelation. And then, of course, we looked into reinforcement learning. In reinforcement learning, of course, people told us, yes, we understand exactly what exploration is and how you do it. I mean, so we always work with these agents. And so the basic mathematical structure of reinforcement learning is what's called a Markov decision process, which is kind of here a tuple of a state space. We assume in the entire talk, the simplest case of being discrete, an action space, also discrete. And then you have certain probabilistic transitions. So you can do certain actions and you might actually choose certain probability kernels with which to move to other states in the state space. And then there is this mystic reward function, which is usually given by God. And it's the cheese for the mouse or whatever. And so fine, and that's an interesting mathematical problem. You have an agent, the agent explores and kind of is in an environment, can do certain actions, and there is some cheese, right? And you want to harvest, the mouse wants to harvest, needs to harvest the cheese. And of course, if it has already a world model and knows what the actions mean in terms of transitioning between sensor states, you can ask what is the optimal way to harvest the cheese. But then there's, of course, also in reinforcement, this more difficult scenario where actually you don't know exactly the environment. So this is here symbolized by the clouds. So you know it's parts of the environment, you know how to navigate there, but other parts you don't even know what the structure of the maze is. And this then leads to a kind of what reinforcement learning people call this exploration trade-off. So then they say, okay, if there are these clouds, it might make sense to spend some time in the clouds and forgo some reward to explore. Usually this is then done just by random actions. And so kind of this is the exploration, is the mouse being in clouds, investigating clouds, no idea if there's some food, but improving the world model. And so the idea is there's a balance between the two. But both still is in the scenario of the reward harvesting. And so we said, wait a moment, let's look at animal behavior. This is just a random video from YouTube. I hope you can see what's happening. So here's a bird, and it has a piece of trash, and you can see how it used as a slit to actually slit down the roof. And once it's down, it actually takes it into the beak, puts it up again, sits in it again, and goes down again. And so it repeats this behavior. And so what's going on here? This is amazing. So first it needed to have discovered kind of the mechanical properties of this yogurt lid on the snow, that it can use it as a slit, right? This is kind of question one that it somehow needed to answer. And then once it discovered that there is actually something sliding, it needed to probably practice how to actually sit on this thing and go down the roof, right? It's amazing. So and there is no reward. The bird apparently is well fed. It doesn't look too skinny. So somehow it solved the food problem, and now it does this. Why? What's going on here? So that is what we were interested in. And of course, we were not the first to be interested in that. But it's not, interestingly, these kind of exploration paradigms are not the main topic of any discipline. So for example, in behavioral science and psychology, there are a few kind of people highlighting this, but it is not, I would say, a major research area. And the first is really a Russian scientist in the 19th century that actually studied dog behavior and discovered something that he called the "what is it" reflex. So a dog, and you will know this if you have ever spent half an hour with a dog, sometimes they kind of guide their attention very quickly to something that seems out of order, and then kind of keep focused on that. And so this was kind of maybe one of the early, I don't know if it's the earliest discovery. And this was then later also, Pavlov is not known for that. This was not his main work, but he knew, of course, of Ivan Sechenov, and is also actually doing some follow-up investigations on this reflex. And then there were other people in psychology. Then in the 50s, an interesting one is Harry Harlow, who was mainly interested in rearing, how actually kind of young animals grow up. And he studied rhesus monkeys. This is actually a picture of one of his rhesus monkeys. And he kind of used exploration as a behavioral marker for actually the little monkey being comfortable near the mother. Because he noticed that whenever the animal is, that the young animal is comfortable, vicinity of the mother, it would start to do this crazy, start to explore unknown things and start to do strange things also with its body and so on. So it was kind of very interesting. He used it as a marker, and he then developed these so-called cloth mothers and showed that you can actually imprint the young monkeys on just this puppet, and then this still works, and he feels that some comfortable. I have to say this research was controversial in the end, and actually my wife, who studied at the University of Wisconsin, inherited one of these highly neurotic experimental subjects by Harlow. So I don't know, but it's very interesting that he used exploration as a behavioral marker. And then, of course, there was Corinne Hutt, and she really studied exploration and play, and also made a distinction between exploration and play in children. So she just did behavioral research in children, but unfortunately died in 1979, and everything stopped. And then, as far as I can tell, not so much was going on in psychology, but then the theme was taken up again. And here our colleague Alison Gopnik, she actually wrote a book, Scientist in the Crib, which is very much actually, so some of her research really continued with research of Corinne Hutt, and what exploration looks like in children. And also, I mean, it's very clear that it's usually happening in a comfortable child. It's not if the child is looking for food. If basic things are taken care of, and then this starts, and it's very strong. There are these amazing movies of actually time-lapse movie of just a child in a little room full of toys, and you can see, over the course of 2 hours, the child leaves no toy untouched. It just was like a whirlwind through the entire room, and it's really amazing to see that. Okay, so what's actually the theoretical basis to study this? And we don't think it's reinforcement learning, but you can, of course, bend reinforcement. You can say, well, the reward function maybe is not constant, but is actually variable over time, and maybe it represents something like the knowledge of your current knowledge about the environment. So you can, of course, tweak this, but I would say a much more natural framework to understand this is actually optimal experimental design developed in statistics. And the idea is there you have you're a scientist, you already got a grant 2 years ago, so you have actually some experiments under your belt. You developed some models, some theory, and the question is now, what should be the next grant proposal? What is the next experiment? What is basically, given your current model, the best next experiment to actually change your current model, to find out that your current model is wrong? This is kind of the question, and this is exactly the scientist in the room somehow. Okay. And it's very interesting that actually Claude Shannon, so Claude Shannon is, of course, developed his famous book, Information Theory, in 1949. But in 1951, he actually experimented with an artificial mouse that he called Theseus, that actually had a kind of an electromechanical brain just built from some electrical relays. It was under the maze, and somehow, and the mouse actually learned to autonomously navigate actually such a maze. And it's very interesting that he thought of this, because the next slide is a little bracket of actually how information theory became important for neuroscience. You can see. So you can see that there are kind of these different themes. So one is, of course, just neural coding. One is, interestingly, actually synaptic memory. It's kind of, so neural coding is just kind of the channel capacity between two pools of neurons. Given the statistics, given you know the statistics of the input pool of neurons, what is the best code to certain objectives for the output. Synaptic memory capacity is kind of the information channel between neural activity and the synaptic waves and back. It's also just an information channel. And so some people applied information theory to understand learning and learning rules and so on. And among those is actually Günter Pahl, my advisor. And then there is also this active exploration, right? And how can you describe what you already know? How can you formulate this in a question? What's the best next question given what you already know? So kind of, and it's interesting that Shannon immediately jumped to this most sophisticated topic somehow. He did not spend time, studying neural coding himself or synaptic memory capacities. He started with this little automatic mouse and tried to explore how he could use this idea for. So now let me dive in a little bit more in this right branch. And of course, this is not only information theory. It actually starts in statistics. So Christine Smith, she was a collaborator of Pearson. And she thought about optimal experimental design in the context of function interpol. So if you have certain support functions of a function, and you try to interpolate another function with using splines or whatever, the question is, if someone gives you another support point, which one should you choose? And it's basically the same problem. And so she actually single-handedly, I would say, started what history made optimal experimental design. And yeah, and then it's, yeah.
You mean which support should you pick to learn about?
No, I mean, so you have a few, exactly, you have a few functions where you have a few points where you know the value of the function. And now the interpolation problem is now to tell the function value at points where you don't have a support. And so the question is now, if you are allowed to choose, given your current set of support functions, and your current model of the curve, if you're allowed to choose one more support point, where would this point be? That is kind of she describes in this 1980. And then it's also very interesting in statistics. Then is the uprise of Bayesian kind of Bayesian statistics. Problems like optimal experimental design became kind of came to the foreground because it you always go kind of from a prior with some information using the likelihood to a posterior, right? So it's very natural to ask how much information did you gain by this one point that you add now, with the likelihood to the prior in order to get a posterior distribution. And so Lindley was a guy who kind of then defined information gain, and I will come a little bit later to the precise description of that. And then there was also a guy actually at University of Tübingen where I studied, he also applied information theory, very interesting biological problems already in the early 70s. And our definition of information gain is kind of put it on his definition of missing information.
Can I add one thing?
Yeah.
It's not a definition, it's a derivation. There's a paper from 3 years earlier from Hobson that actually starts from basic axioms or the intuitive requirements and derives KL as a definition of missing information, but it's not a definition there, it's just a derivation.
Well, it is a definition in the sense because, I mean, you're looking at some biological system.
Oh, yeah, I mean, his application, but the idea that information is a general thing, like an abstract thing. But when you apply it to biological systems, it becomes a definition.
I would disagree. So it's really, information theory is mathematics. Mm-hmm. And now you declare certain things. So for example, the definition of information. I mean, if you talk to a psychologist about this definition of Shannon, they would disagree. They would say this is information. So I think this is, we should not be overly confident and say, oh yeah, it's just a derivation and this is cut in stone. No, it's not. There is kind of an intersection, there is kind of an interface between mathematics and empirical things we talk about and try to somehow grasp, and I would call this a definition. No, I'm sorry, I would strongly disagree.
So, I think there's always some definitions you start from, like, some axioms or basics, like, I don't know, the existence of numbers or like measures or something like that. But then after that point, you start with some intuitive requirements that you want this, equation to satisfy. And then that becomes a derivation from then onward. But of course, always there is some definition that you start from. I'm just saying, like, it's a little deeper in the abstraction. Anyway, I'll show you later.
Anyway, and then one person who was also very important in this developing the theory for this exploration is David McKay. There's this beautiful book that it's free on the internet. Unfortunately, he also died quite young. But it's an amazing book that goes between information theory and statistics, and it's a very unique perspective. And he has a neural computation paper from the early 90s where he talks about information-based objective functions for active data selection, which is kind of a very modest way to do active learning. Basically, choose among a pile of learning data, and you kind of choose. And then also, I mean, there's people like Oxford and Taylor. There are people in psychology who then really developed some more size theory, but I would say there's also a lot of ad hoc definitions of, and I will come to that later, of actually information that don't make much sense in a mathematical sense.
There's a bunch of that.
Okay, so now I will just go through a few definitions, and again, you can also, I mean, there's basically our stuff is written up in two papers. There's this big, longer paper by Daniel, and then a Nurup's paper, which is about unbounded environments, exploring unbounded environments. So, but so I will not go through every epsilon here, but hopefully give you a general understanding of the reasoning. So, yeah, so basically, if you have a probabilistic model, so theta are the parameters, and x are the observations. What Lindley said is that basically want to do is, of course, just the parameters so that actually your model, the data gets good. So there's always this interplay between the data and parameters. This kind of important. And usually, as Jason, you also you basically assume that they are higher on the parameters, and so now basically you can now what Lindley defined the average information gain is the information is now you have a new data point, and you can kind of write basically the information or the entropy of theta given the new data point, and you subtract the unconditional the unconditional information with the unconditional. And so this is what he defines is kind of the information that lies in this one data point. And then he averages this across the data points. And he ends up then with a Kullback-Leibler divergence, which looks like this and is just the usual Shannon capacity. So it's basically just the mutual information between data point and your parameters. And this is a way to write mutual information. So you can write it as the difference between joint of x and theta and the factorial. So if you factorize it, if you ask how well can I approximate the joint by a factorized such where you write p of x comma theta as p of x times theta. Of course, if this perfectly works, then the KL divergence is 0 between these two things, and the mutual information is 0. Whenever there is something remaining, then there is actually some information between the two variables. So that's very basic.
I'm trying to understand the math here. So in the first line, I is equals E of EX IX, and then 2 lines below that, it's EX KL, posterior and prior. So if you take away the expectation over X, then IX should equal the KL between posterior and prior, but I just don't see that from the equation.
You will not see everything from the equation here. So, and we will not go into the
Okay.
otherwise I won't make it for the talk. But I think it's correct. But
it's not the main point, right?
It's not the main point.
Reviewing the
exactly. It's really just a review, but let's not go down to this detail. The important thing is really basically this information gain defined by Lindley. So the information gain is a mutual information between the parameters and the data point. And so this is actually the McKay paper, and he defines maybe skipped. So suffice it to say that there is many different definitions of information gain already in the literature. So it's not really a field where there is nothing. There is a lot, but unfortunately also things have been renamed. For example, Aldi and ET renamed this old definition or name of Bayesian information gain by Bayesian surprise and so on. But let's go. So now let's actually come to the this information measure that, and this kind of starts on this definition of missing information of the current estimate. So let's see, we see some data that are drawn from a ground truth distribution P of X. You don't have access to P. And all you can do is estimate P of X by a P hat. And now Pfaffel-Huber defined missing information as this as the KL between the ground truth and the estimate. And of course, this has an interpretation. This the KL can be written as the the entropy of in Px. It's Can you read this? So P is basically h of P or minus h. It's minus P for P over X, right? So this is the entropy. And the second term is the cross entropy, which is integral P of X log P of Q, P log P hat.
That also negative, or?
No, because this is in the denominator, right? So L is right. L is integral P of X. P of X divided by P hat of.
Yeah.
Okay, and that gives you the plot.
Yeah, but there's no negative outside. KL
No,
equals that integral.
no, exactly. Yes, that's a half equal sign.
And then if you bring it to the denominator, there's a negative sign. Anyways,
no. I mean, this is entropy has minus P log.
Yeah,
but
I'm saying
like
like
minus P.
if you bring this out here, it's log P hat. It's like log 1 over P hat. And there's a negative introduced by that operation, bringing that to the denominator.
Oh yeah, okay. So you're it's minus and also of course the entropy is defined by minus. Yeah, so this is plus entropy. And so therefore you can basically now interpret what this actually means, this missing information. So it's really the access bits that you need to represent your data point if your current estimate is different from P and is P hat. And that's a reasonable definition for missing information. For that reason, we start. Okay. And so now, yeah, easy. You can, the information gain is then just, you ask, if you see one new data point, you ask, what's the difference? The old. This is then the reduction in this. In the following, you will see a lot of curves that all go down, because this is a good kind of, if you know the ground truth P of X, then this is a good this is a kind of it's a good objective of how well you actually learn distribution, but is of course not directly usable as an internal objective by the agent, because the agent doesn't know P. The agent would know P. There's no learning.
So the agent cannot compute I.
I am. You can, yeah, and I exactly.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but if the data are, if P of X is fixed, if you don't get to control or modify X, you have enough samples from X, and this is in maximum likelihood to minimize this because the entropy of the ball is fixed. You're fine.
Entropy of the ball is fixed.
Exactly. Too much detail here, but
Very nuanced point.
it's very complicated when you explain.
Yeah,
yeah.
The entropy of the world is fixed when you're giving data
You are
passively.
passively,
But if you're actively exploring, it's no longer fixed. So
Yes, okay.
that's the whole point I'm gonna tell in the self-work models.
Okay, cool. Yeah. You can't compute this, and
No, and we don't want to. We
Yeah.
don't have to.
Cool.
Okay, and so now a little bit to the notation that we will use. So the world model is kind of it's an MDP minus the reward, right? So it's basically all that an MDP has, but there's no reward function now. So it's an action space and a space of discrete actions, a space of discrete states in these transition kernels and of this type that if you are in a certain state, you apply a certain action, you will with certain probabilities transition to other states as time. And of course, these are kind of categorical distributions. And we see a little bit of funny notation, but I introduce it here because we use the table. So we often write this then as kind of a theta, which is kind of so this is kind of a super naive parameterization of a categorical distribution, where basically each probability value just has basically as a theta value, which has now the index A as prime. And how to read this is really so from the left to right. You apply action. You apply action A in state S, and you transition to S. And yeah. Yeah, and the learning task is then, of course, you want to approximate these thetas, which the environment knows, but it only gives you samples from it by theta heads. It's kind of what you want to learn. And so now we apply this in a super simple environment. So in one, we really just use a Dirichlet prior to actually generate these transition matrices and put them in kind of a state space, and this is we call dense worlds. And then here we have a more structured environment. So one is actually it's kind of a maze-like environment where you have these walls. Usually, if you move to a wall, you just stay in the old state. But there are these so-called teleporters. So if you, for example, if I am in state 13 and move to the left, then actually I am transported to this absorbing state 29. So it's very easy to end up in state 29.
Wait, why are you introducing the teleporters? Why not just have a maze?
Because this will turn out to be. And so what I can say here is that we want really to study how planning in exploration can help you. So if you do optimal experimental design, you plan, you need to plan, you have already some data, you have a model, and you can now to plan what is the best new data point. And it will turn out that in some situations, like in these dense worlds, you don't need to do any planning. Random action gets you just as good degrees of missing information as if you do very sophisticated planning. However, if you have environments where you, for example, have absorbing states, or now actually in our current project, we have also time traps. If you have some traps, some states where it's very hard to get out, so you lose a lot of exploration steps there. Then it becomes important to avoid those states and really to kind of navigate around them. And this is then when exploration needs to be. And this is really what then makes a difference. So we don't need, so our information theoretically driven agent only is better if you have environments where you do need planning.
Is this the right way to think that the maze without teleportation is too simple? That the entropy of the world is too low, that we don't need any planning? And
there's nothing to do with entropy. It's just you don't need to plan because you will end up, in the end of the day, what you need to do to get good estimates of the theta, of these theta parameters, you need to see enough observations. And so if there's an absorbing state, you see always the absorbing state and around it. And then if you don't avoid to get back, to immediately get back because you hit the next teleport, you will only see the absorbing state, and you will have a wide map in most of the maze. This is where it becomes, because you need sample. And if this is hard to get, and if something keeps you from getting it, you need to plan in order to get it. That's kind of the makes sense. And yeah, the third environment was one where we mainly change the complexity of the actions can take it different states. So some states you can in 3 actions.
So just to be clear, the setup is you have an agent where the states and actions are known and fully observable, but the transitions are unknown.
The maze example you have global, but you know where you are, Google.
You know globally where you are. But the next sophistication, which actually didn't do, is you have partially observed. Yeah, and so now given a set of data, difference about what's kind of the best estimate, right? And then of course the second problem is the exploration problem. Given a current model ahead, how should an agent choose actions to best improve? And yeah, and it turns out that actually Bayesian inference is actually the best you can do to minimize on average the missing information. So, right. And so this shows you somehow. So this shows you exactly what I just explained. So here, black is dark is proportional to missing information. And so if you just have a random agent navigating in this maze environment with the teleporters, actually after a while you have this picture, and it doesn't change very much. You can run this forever, and you will actually keep here these dark spots.
So that blue circles, that's a target that you have to go.
There is no target. Forget about targets.
What does that represent?
It's the absorbing state. So in other words, whenever you hit here, if you take an action that mostly you're here, this state, and you take the action that corresponds probabilistically mostly to left, you go left, you end up here.
I see, I see. So
Yeah,
all the teleportation
exactly.
leads you there. I
Yes.
get
It's
it.
an absorbing
Okay.
state. So it's super easy. If you hit any of these blue gates, end up in this. Okay. And so now, you can kind of look a little bit at these missing information codes. And here we just have two agents. One is random action, and that's in red, and the other one is unembodied. And what I mean with unembodied is that usually embodied means if you are in the state as you take an action A, it gets you to the state S prime. Your next action is taken at S prime. In the unembodied, in the so-called unembodied agent, you can really sample action end state. So there's definitely no planning problem. Because no matter what you ended up, you can just lift yourself off in any other state and choose any action you want. And so that's kind of a ground. This is kind of the best we would expect you can actually. I mean, you can't reduce the missing information faster than if you basically can freely choose state end. There's no planning problem. There's nothing hidden from you. Go everywhere, sample everywhere.
The red is the baseline, black is the highlight.
Exactly. So the lower line is actually that is the best you could do. And this is random action. And of course, if you don't do better than random action, then forget it. Then use random action, right? Forget information theory. And what you can already see here, in the dense worlds, there is just nothing, no space between the two worlds. So there's whatever you do is kind of as good as everything else. So this is not a very interesting, this is not an environment that you like to study policies for exploration. However, here in these two world models, you have kind of a margin. The question is now, if you with our algorithm, very clever policy, how, where does it lie? That's just to set a little. And yeah, and now another thing that we show in the paper that actually, if you, on average, you can actually, so if you form these differences between missing information where you added another data point, he told you can't compute it because there's the theta. But on average, we can show actually you can write this expectation of missing information. You can actually write it in terms of a KL term that only contains S. So this is something the agent can compute, and this is what we call information gain. And now, what is this strange notation? So this is now a funny thing. This is just the current estimate. So that the theta at the SS prime is the current estimate. And now our agent needs to do a strange thing to actually be able to compute. It needs to compute, it actually needs to compute these theta heads that have this arrow in it. And so what this means is that you sample a certain action, you sample your model, a certain action, you end up with an S prime. And now you actually integrate this S prime using Bayesian inference again, you integrate this into now a changed set of theta heads. So in a way, this is like an internal simulation in your head. You sample your own model, and you do that if you are in a certain state S and you want to actually figure out what is the next state I should take. You do this for all the available actions. And then you actually take the one that has the highest G. And yes, that is basically how it works. And so now you can kind of compare how this for the different
So before about the previous slide, I think you're talking about world models way before it was cool. This is what a world model is, just you're simulating the.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a simulation idea. So it's something where you kind of need to create a fictitious data point, integrate it this, and then and so it's also you can kind of understand now the maximum the action that maximizes this leads to new theta, these fictitious data points that are differ the most from your current model. So in a way, you want to take the action that startles your current model the most. That's kind of the.
Yeah, a question, how did the theta disappear here? Right.
Yeah, so you can show that on average, it actually so that it's through this averaging process.
The expectation. Yeah.
Okay.
I think this is cool. Maybe let's just put this a little more like, sorry. So you're simulating the world in your head, and then you're assigning value in the potential outcomes. The value just comes from which one gives you the biggest thing. And then you take action. So yeah, I guess we can discuss that this behind the discussion, but you didn't really take the next step of adding some other sorts of value, which is more standard to reinforcement learning. There's a target, a goal, and see how they interact. Exploration and exploration.
Right.
You don't.
Maybe in the end, I can talk a little bit. We would like sometimes to combine this with another object. And the nice thing with this object is also it actually decays. So if something is very novel to you, the updates, if a single data point makes a lot of difference in the heads, you see quite big contributions of the PRG. But you could easily add up another reinforcement, just a reward function, which is constant. And in the beginning, it would do more exploration once it knows them.
Let's keep that to the discussion.
Okay. And so now here is and they are disappointing. I mean, here it's not bad. So the green guy is now very did this sophisticated, complicated thing. And so you see here, it kind of halves the margin between the unembodied and the random. But here for the mazes, it's super disappointing. So what you need to do is actually you should not do that this in a greedy fashion. You need to do a little bit of value. So actually what we did then was actually optimization with a longer time horizon. This is then where we actually see possible. So that's another kind of important insight. So if the environment is complicated, it's not good enough to have a good objective that the agent can evaluate about the learning progress. You also need to evaluate. You somehow need to have a longer time horizon.
I guess if somebody sees this like a mainstream RL practitioner, they might just say, you're doing RL, but you're just defining this intrinsic reward function as your PIG.
Oh, yeah, of course. But again, I mean, usually the reward function is constant. So you have to deal then with a reinforcement learning framework that can deal with this changing over time, changing. Then of course, everything is reward. Okay, and so this just shows, so then we compared this to many other things in the literature, and actually, so there's other heuristics like least taken action, counter-based. So there's actually a lot in the literature, and actually this green line, ours. And then we also, of course, because we were pressed by the reviewers, we also asked, well, if you actually use your objective and then later you get a reward problem, is this really competitive? And we showed this, but this was more for the reviewers. I will do it. So this was kind of the 2013 paper or 2012 paper. And then in this NeurIPS paper, the only thing we did is we said, okay, can we somehow extend this categorical distribution to actually disciplines to actually evolve with infinite states? And we basically use the Chinese restaurant process. You can, of course, do this. Use kind of empirical base to then parameters, and bottom line, it works. You can do this, so that's not a very difficult organization. And of course, you have it's kind of another degree of freedom. So if you have these infinite worlds now, infinite mazes, they are not infinite yet, but very big. You can see that compared to a competitor method, ours explores more states. But we think you can kind of some free parameters in the objective function, even in ours, that you can actually either go for more exploration and less in-depth optimization of the transition probabilities to states you have already seen, or the other way. So you can either go more broad or more deep, smaller. So you can, I think, so it does not, so the fact that here ours explores more states, we don't think this is necessarily a good or bad thing. We think you could actually adjust also our objective to go either more in depth or.
Could you say another word about, yeah, like what do you mean by in-depth versus?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's if there's always in your categorical distribution there is some probability left that you discover a new state. And then once you discovered it, you add it to your states, and then there's something left that you discover something new. Now you could either have an objective function that tries to actually plan to stay in the already discovered states, kind of to avoid this probability mass that gets you into a novel state. And then you would have an agent that goes depth first, that really tries to explore a smaller area in this infinite maze and get very good estimates of the thetas. As opposed to an agent that actually also that actually plans more to actually hit these novel states, to discover new states. With every new state it discovers, it also has to estimate quite a number of transition curves, right? So there is a trade-off in depth, discovering as much as possible states versus good transition kernels between actually a smaller set of known states. This is kind of, I think, this is kind of the trade-off you get yourself into if your world is infinite. Yeah.
Is the transition kernels like the arrow theta you were talking about before?
No. I mean, the arrow theta are these transition kernels that contain fictitious data points. So the idea that the theta heads are estimated from the observed data, but these arrow theta heads, they contain fictitious data points sampled with a particular action, and now you can compare the current estimate with this fictitious new estimate that includes your fictitious new data point and compute the PIG. But this has nothing to do with it. So this is more. I think, yeah, this is more. Again, I think in the planning there's a degree of freedom whether you want to maximize discovering as much new states as you possibly can, versus to have a very good estimate of the transition probability, so that you have a smaller set of known states and you can navigate between them quite comfortably with your transition curves. Okay. Yeah, there are quite crazy information measures that look a little bit similar, but then are different in the psychology literature. So, for example, you can do here something similar, but then you take the maxes of these, or you take the L1 norm. So it's crazy. I don't have any justification.
You know why? Because yours is a derivation. I'll show you after that. It's a very elegant derivation.
Okay. And then, of course, also, this is something, have a manuscript, and actually, it would be great, Hardy, maybe I should explain to you what I have. And so I also try, similar to what you did in your work, to reduce the zoo a little bit. And so it can also be shown that you can actually write PIG as a mutual information term. It's basically, it's the mutual information between sample data point and then sample data point after you use this sample data point, after you have integrated this in your. And so you can write PIG as a mutual information, but it is a quite different animal, for example, compared to predictive information that other people have used, and so on. But it would be interesting to describe this a little bit more. Just a theory of it. I have a few pages of this. Somehow I didn't have to discuss it with.
I'd love to, yes.
Okay, but yeah, let's bring it to the end. So in summary, I really think it's good to understand optimal experimental design if you are thinking about learning in action perception. I think this helps. You should study the statistics literature. There's also something, kind of a subfield of this in statistics, which is called sequential optimal experimental design. This is, of course, exactly what. And I have not followed the most recent papers, would be interesting, but this is definitely an important connection I think you should keep in mind. And then, I mean, we were quite happy about this result that actually maximizing PIG minimizes the missing information. So you don't use any ground truth. And then, yes, I described a little bit for the unbounded environments. That's kind of not so difficult to do. So that's kind of what I showed you today. I know that is very naive models, very simple also in terms of how the model are parameterized. So there's a lot of work to be done. I now actually, so we have now a working group where we address some of these kind of future things. And what our current study group kind of focuses is really experimental tests of these different information theory based applications. We can also compare the Lindley Bayesian approach with the PIG approach and so on, and really to design kind of environments where we can test actually human subjects. Unifying the zoo, I already talked about that. And then, of course, very important is this is just discovery and exploration, first contact with a new environment, with a new object. It's very important that this will not go on. This is in the beginning important, and it's unimportant. And then something else happens. If you start, and this described this in her work, that basically children first start to do this exploration, what's there, what kind of toys, and then they engage in a more focused way with it. And it's very interesting because I think also there is no objective reward unless this is something like that, right? So there's no but somehow certain things become interesting for you. For example, if you play, with a pendulum, there are certain, you want to check out certain parts in the state space of the dynamical system or in the phase space of the dynamical system that do interesting things. How can we describe this? So I think there's another level, already more goal-directed things, but the goal are self-defined. It's a little bit like you study a certain topic and you fall in love with the topic and you go on and study it more and more and you kind of zoom in, but no one tells you to do this. Somehow it becomes more interesting to you the more you know. I think that is very important. We need to understand how this goes from maybe something like PIG to get a lay of the land, to then actually focus in on interesting stuff. Interesting. What does this mean? How can we describe this? And
I feel like this connects to, so people are trying to make these LLMs agents and they fail because they don't have taste. That is, I think, the question, right? How does this taste in different?
Wait, so this might be already in the world model that you've set up, right? Because there's these transition kernels that you have to learn the dynamics between states. So you've selected which category of, like, 'cause there's this Chinese restaurant process as well, which is like, which of all possible states am I in?
Yeah.
And it's possible in the world that it's like, there's some threshold where you're like, okay, add a new category of dynamics, right? And now I actually have to start learning again what the transition model is, right? So it's basically,
what would be the new category?
well, I don't know. So I'm thinking about, like, basically I've discovered a new toy and it operates in this surprising way that breaks my model. So I need a new category of dynamics for it. But
How do you discover the affordances, like the set of possible affordances that were in
I have to linger once I've got this new category. How do I update my
See, it
transition?
doesn't break your expectations, and start really. The toy becomes interesting once you figured out a lot about, maybe not everything, but a lot.
Yeah.
And now you start, like if it's a pendulum, you try to balance it on the other point or something like that. So this, I would say this, it's really different from discovering something novel in terms of how this thing behaves. Now you zoom into a certain regime which is challenging to attain, like, for example, the balancing pole pendulum. And you try to figure out this small space, where you can keep this.
It's like you've discovered a state that could exist, right? So you've added a new state, but you don't have the dynamics matrix to get there. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Is it about states or affordances? Like, let's go back to the bird.
well, that's why I was
Right,
wondering.
so how did the bird discover that you can use the plastic fin for sliding? That's a new affordance that didn't exist in the bird plane before. And it's not a state transition, it is also state.
It is a state. It's not a transition. It's not a transition. It's a state. So like,
Yeah.
so like, think about it in your model, right? There's this categorical distribution over states of the world, and then there's a transition model, which is basically the probability of state, the estimated state given the current state and an action, right? And so when the animal discovers that there is a new state, which is me sliding down a tray, I've discovered that long before I have the dynamics model for how to actually use my action to get to that state. Does that make, am I?
It is not only a new state, it's also a new action, like that's the action of sliding.
Right, I have to learn this completely new
It's
of
an
S
open
prime
world
given
state, right?
S and A. Like I've identified that there exists a state that I can't get to, right? Is that possible in
I don't
think so?
No, you
Maybe
stumble
can
upon
discuss
state.
it. So let me just put up the last slide.
But there's
Then we,
one more
let's
question
go to.
before we go there.
Yeah.
Theo, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, I'm curious as to I guess the best way to think about kind of the differences between states and actions and affordances and these various things, particularly in the scenario where it is something like tool use. Because the tool is a separate object, and you could categorize it as having its own separate phase space, which is, coupled into the rest of this, world model dynamical system, which is, of course, like Hilbert space to the 17, trillion or whatever. But I think I'm not sure that that is a useful characterization, because in some sense, it's like a joke in the state space modeling community that a state is whatever you can't describe. That like anything that you would like to say is a state of something, you can just say is a state, the same way that, when we're fitting a linear dynamical system to some process and we don't know what the actual variables are. I mean, like in a circuit, you have charge, you have magnetic flux, whatever, these are dynamical variables that evolve over time. But if I just have an input-output pair and I'm trying to fit a model to it, it could have any number of states. It could be rank 17 billion. It could be rank 4. And those states that I identify in my system identification method, whether it be some sort of like eigenmode decomposition or whatever it may be, really have very little to do with the actual states of the capacitors and whatever that are inside this system. And so I just wanted to kind of like push back a little bit on this idea that we're collecting these states of different objects, or we're like inferring
Yeah.
a state of a
Mhm.
world model that is, this kind of thing. It's like it would necessarily be so infinite that I think I'm not sure that this is a useful concept of like, oh, we just add another state and add another transition matrix, because every time you add a new object, you add all of its dynamical variables and all of the transition probabilities on
Good
its
point.
dynamical variables and all of its coupled transition probabilities to all of its. It's like I'm not sure that this is a useful way of describing this. And I'm curious what the alternative is, but I think
I'm also, I would agree. I mean, and I'm glad you mentioned tool use. I think that is maybe a good example, right? That a tool, if you once you figured out what you can do with the tool, you need to practice out like a music instrument also. You need to practice with it, right? Then it becomes something almost like an extension of your body, right? And I mean, it's very interesting also how actually, of course, what children do is figure out their own body dynamics, right? A lot is really about your own body, which is, of course, in the beginning, not even clear for the child probably how to distinguish this something outside. And it needs to figure that out. What do I have correct control? Where does this end? And now, but if I now take it into my hands, now I can reach something I couldn't reach before. I think, yeah.
I think this is an interesting
yeah, let's
direction.
Just wanted to add one more point about this open-endedness. Like somebody wrote a piece about Knightian uncertainty as a limitation of like probabilistic approaches, which I like. But if you have a probability measure and like the finite support, then the notion of unknown unknowns is not reconcilable with that. Like, and tool use, like, the probability of inventing a wheel is 0 until you invent it, and it's 1 after that. So it's like, it's just very, very uninterpretable. And so if you want to really have like a proper model of agency, we have to move beyond this closed.
Yes. And I mean, another thing that also touches on this problem that there's just too many states is really, we would like to have this more in a continuous state in action space. And then it's actually interesting that, and I think this is what we do as humans, that you start to postulate this continuous space, maybe in a discrete fashion. Where you have a certain pattern for throwing a ball. It's not always the same. There's infinitely many patterns in this glass of throwing a ball, infinitely many motion patterns. But for you, it's a discrete class and so on. And of course, this involves a lot of difficult problems, right, if you start to discretize a continuous space. So therefore, but again, this is also something, I think it's very hard to just look at these discrete state space models and action space models, and then to somehow argue about how we.
I feel like this is like part of the fundamental challenge of science is like, nothing is actually discrete until you go into, super quantum land where nothing is, relevant to us so immediately. But I think where do we draw these boundaries that are fundamentally arbitrary is important, because some of the boundaries are really useful and some of the boundaries are utterly useless. And the more boundaries we have, the more cognitive load there is in terms of considering them, because each one introduces, a factorial increase in the number of kind of coupling states. And so, I think that this is a similar problem to what we talked about recently in terms of like the tensor like composition stuff, and that basically every time you add a new tensor, there's no way to like just add a tensor to this part of another tensor. It couples the entire thing, and that's nice, but it's also not entirely useful, because most of the transition states are completely disallowed, and most things are completely uncoupled, except for in very small regions. And that kind of like bounded support versus unbounded support, I think, is a very fundamental problem. Even
I agree. So we can discuss about this more. Last slide. Currently, I have a small group of researchers in my lab. Basically, it's some undergraduate students, some Enrico, who is from the Kaufer lab, and are actually looking comparing these different agents with behavior. So stay tuned. We are almost ready to deploy one of these games. So that's currently going on, but some of the other points on my previous slide list are also to me. I don't have any update. So thanks for your attention. Now let's you free form.
Yeah, thanks, Fritz.
Yeah.
It was amazing.